everyone, and welcome to the State of Cyber Defense Diagnosing Cyber Threats in Healthcare webinar. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few housekeeping items for this webinar. Today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. You'll also find handouts in the client section that are available for download at any time during this presentation as you're listening and watching the slides. As you already know, we're using GoToWebinar for this presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor that I just mentioned. Through that client, you'll also be able to submit questions at any time, and our presenters will address these questions at the end of the presentation. We really encourage you to ask questions, so please do send them over so that they can be answered. We are very fortunate to have leading experts joining us today to provide their expert analysis. On the call, we have Devin Ackerman, who is the Global Head of Digital Forensics and Incident Response at Kroll. We have Jeff Mako, the Associate Managing Director at Kroll, specializing in offensive security and identifying risks for systems and networks running in virtualized and cloud-based environments. And we also have Lynn Sessions, a partner at Baker Hostetler, who leads the Healthcare Privacy and Compliance team in the Digital Assets and Data Management Practice Group, and also serves as national co-lead of the healthcare industry team. So on that note, I'm going to leave you in the very capable hands with Devin and Jeff to provide a brief overview of what we're going to be discussing today. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much. Let's dive into the next slide. So we are going to be, just like the slide says, diagnosing cyber threats, but specific to the healthcare industry vertical. We're going to be leveraging both from the kind of what I call right of boom type viewpoint, incident response, to the left of boom, the proactive, the preparing you so that hopefully the audience and the attendees never have to talk to my teams dealing with an incident, and that would be Jeff Mako and his capabilities and his expertise. We're also joined, as mentioned in the last slide, by Lynn Sessions. And so we're going to be talking about the healthcare industry vertical from really these three different viewpoints: the reactive, the proactive, and the legal aspect. Because in any investigation I've ever been a part of, that is exactly how we guide our clients and victims of some type of cyber threat incident, especially within the healthcare industry. And so we're going to talk about this from a detection response perspective kind of first, which is typically aligning with how clients can better themselves, prepare themselves, and really take a not if, but when type viewpoint on having an incident or a compromise, whether it's a 0-day, a nation state, organized crime group. And so from there, the cyber threat intelligence aspect of this. No current healthcare industry on the planet can frankly protect themselves from all threats. This would be said for any industry vertical. And so one of the things that we typically try to bring to bear is the threat intelligence to help us understand the trends and the tactics that are emerging so we can better inform and educate from Jeff's perspective and Lynn's perspective to help ensure we raise the bar with our clients, with those that we're consulting for, so they don't become the next victim. Jeff, you want to touch on the offensive security part?
Yeah, thanks, Devin. Yeah, as Devin mentioned, the primary purpose of us on offensive security and proactive services here is to assist organizations that we work with in understanding where their risks are in advance of an event. It is very difficult in any large organization to prioritize risk. And one of the key advantages we have here at Kroll is, unfortunately, thanks to Devin's team, or fortunately thanks to Devin's team, we have tremendous amounts of data on how organizations are having events occur, where the primary cause was, how it started, where the controls were insufficient, perhaps where the monitoring was insufficient, that would help companies reduce some of those risks. And we base all of our proactive services here based upon what is current as far as risk, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to be able to protect companies for what happened 20 years ago that was exactly the best practice back then, but we need to look at what's happening now in the industry and what we see and base our risk findings based upon that. So, we do a variety of tests, risk assessments, penetration tests, all of those that can help any hospital better understand where their risks are. Devin?
That's perfect. Let's go to the next slide. So we're going to take this conversation focusing on kind of a 10,000-foot view of the way we see the industry from the front lines, right? So from the approximately 3,000 or so investigations that we do annually, there is a large percentage of those within the healthcare industry vertical. And so next slide, we're going to show you some of the data that we've actually gleaned over the years of doing what we do, I think, best, which is consulting and providing and navigating during an incident, during a bad day, that right of boom comment I made earlier, where something has gone boom, right? It's not always ransomware. Sometimes it's an insider threat. Sometimes it's a little more simple, like a business email compromise, but something has happened, and we are typically leaned upon to enhance or augment or lead an investigation into what happened. And then ultimately, the board, the C-suite, the IT team wants to know what went wrong. How do we keep this from happening again? And that leads to this type of data, right? Where we're able to identify against industry standards, against best practice and recommendations, reasonableness standards, where we see the victims, the clients we're working with, actually fall within the maturity pendulum. It's interesting how the data speaks for itself. And ultimately, and I don't want to come across as salesy, it is fascinating to me when you see the data from thousands of investigations, thousands of consulting opportunities across the years we've been doing this, and even those that respond to kind of the questionnaires we send out, that 50% of those that have responded or provided feedback feel their cybersecurity is very mature, that they're in a good place. But ultimately, the data actually sometimes sends us in a different way. It doesn't mean that everyone is the low-hanging fruit, that every industry is, especially within healthcare, is always going to be the next target, but it does give us perspective. Healthcare, based on the data it has access to, from protected health information to PII, to payroll, to intellectual property for the next research, the next cancer-saving drug. All of that information makes healthcare an extremely lucrative target for, frankly, every single threat actor out there that is financially motivated. Forget the financial motivation, even to an extent of what I would consider the nation state or advanced persistent threat groups we face, where they are looking to take the data, take the research data, and enhance their own at the jeopardy of the victims. Jeff, any comments on this slide before we move on?
So I'm struck by the number of times I've had conversations with IT and security staff at organizations when I ask, how do you rate your maturity? And if I had to sum it all together, I would probably say that 60 to 70% of them all believe they're above average. And we know that doesn't make a lot of sense. And the challenge on that is, how do they benchmark themselves? How do they understand where their security is? And sometimes that's something that a third party can help with in better understanding, where they are and, how does that map against the risks that they currently have and their tolerance for those risks. So not an easy thing to answer for many orgs.
And Jeff and Lynn, I want your perspective too before we move on. Would you say it's fair that security in this day and age is an ever-evolving, ever-moving benchmark? That what would probably be best in class today is not going to be best in class 3-6 months from now, and that it is not about the maturity of the organization now, it's about where they're going to rise against the next threat. Lynn, what are your perspectives first?
So Devin, when I first started doing this type of work, which has now been 13, 14 years ago, we looked at our practice as being a practice of lost and stolen laptops or insider type threats, right? It seems like so long ago in some ways, but it really wasn't that long ago. And I think it demonstrates exactly what your point that I think you're making, which is this, is that the security landscape continues to evolve. Never in a million years, when I was a med-mal defense lawyer 25 years ago, did I think that I would be talking to the FBI and former colleagues of the FBI on a very regular basis like I do today. And it's the type of incidents that occur that we are seeing that are requiring our security folks to be far more sophisticated, to try to stay one step ahead of the bad guys, and looking, as you described, at the evolving security landscape. So we know how best to protect ourselves and protect the valuable information that we have within our healthcare systems.
Jeff, any last comments before we move on?
It changes every day. And the challenge on it is, as many organizations have hardened their infrastructure, threat actors need to pivot to something else. Threat actors are always going to do the minimum required to get access and not do more. So they're not going to bring the nation state attacks against an organization if they don't need to. So, you know, that's where the challenge happens, is that as the whole industry matures more, everything pivots. And we see that with, you know, better controls over phishing right now for many organizations that weren't there a few years ago. So what do we see now? We see more of a pivot into social engineering, you know, phishing help desks. So it is always going to be that game of back and forth, that as the controls get stronger in certain areas, attackers are going to pivot. And, you know, there will be times, I think, in the future when some of the what's old is new again situation will happen, and the old time attacks from long ago will become relevant again. And we still see that occasionally, where the basics in organizations haven't been done. But yes, they have the best MDR, the best EDR, the best plans, yet people are still storing passwords in Excel spreadsheets on the network. You know, so it's those kind of situations that always are going to occur.
Well, let's jump to the next slide, because I think that underscores the point you're making, right? And this is the last of these two slides, but that self-diagnosis gap, the view of organizations we work with, we consult with, is interesting, because if 39% completely trust they're protected, I would think sometimes that the data that you and I look at from perspective of the response to incidents, or the evolving risk assessments, pen tests, and other related pieces to help close the gaps and raise the security model, actually sometimes don't necessarily align with some of the self-diagnosis gap. Is that what you're seeing, Jeff?
Yeah, that's always it. The challenge for security staff that's with a company is, yes, you understand your organization really well, but you're with one company. You haven't seen the breadth of companies that we have seen that have done things well and done things poorly. And that's a pretty key advantage of looking for outside counsel. You know, is that legal? Yeah, you may not have a lawyer who understands this, so you may need outside counsel. It's the same thing as far as cyber needs. You know, limited engagements with experts really helps you manage your program better. And then you have appropriate guidance that you can use that can go up C-suite board in making sure that they have the faith that you're handling the situation as best as you can.
Okay, meaningful perspective. I want to keep us on track. Let's keep going. Let's go to the next set of slides. So specifically on the response capabilities used by healthcare, what's interesting is the pendulum that we've observed from from the conversations we've had with the industry, but also, frankly, the polls we've done. Only cybersecurity monitoring leading from at the very top is a concerning aspect. And I think this is, from at least a perspective of a responder, this is what sometimes we see in our industry, where it becomes the reliance on the tool to protect the enterprise, the environment, and less on the investigator's mindset, the totality of what the tool is telling me or not telling me. And as a very quick anecdote, in the FBI, one of the things that I participated in was the evaluation of software tools, forensic tools, and their efficacy or veracity to getting us the actual evidence. And look, at the end of the day, a tool is programmed by fallible humans. It is created to ultimately answer a particular question at a moment in time with a data set. Forensic science and what we look at for cybersecurity monitoring has to give us a holistic view. And it's not about the reliance upon one tool. It's a reliance upon tools, but also experience, that what is to be able to identify what's missing. This is a trend we're concerned, we're observant of within the industry. Sometimes when we put a lot of money and investment into the tools deployed within enterprises to help manage what is reasonably overwhelming amounts of events, incidents, and alerts on a daily basis, sometimes the over-reliance on them upends that pendulum. The containment and disruption above all else, though, is also interesting to me because it's in the top 3 to 4 that are in response of this slide and the data we received back. And Jeff, I'd love your comment, frankly, on the crisis management and business continuity piece here, because it's often that I see, and I think Lynn would agree, that we actually see sometimes the growth or maturity only born out of an incident versus the proactive and the preparatory where we aren't necessarily in a firefight. But what's your comment? And we'll move on to the next slide.
So one key statement that's lived with me for many of the 30 years that I've been doing IT, and in the last 10 that I've been focused on security, is if you're not planning for failure, you're planning to fail. And it seems like a defeatist statement, but if you haven't considered the way things can go wrong, things are going to go wrong, and then you're not going to have a plan to deal with them. So, things like tabletop exercises are pretty helpful for an organization to better have alignment on some of the business continuity and DR response that they're going to have when they do have an incident. Hopefully that's something that's being well guided by someone who understands the nuances and where companies have failed in the past, not just purely a rote exercise that you're walking through. But Devin, one of the comments I have on yours with the monitoring is, yes, we see that as well from the penetration testing side, is many organizations have a very high reliance on that. And the number one thing that I tell all of my staff is fancy attacker tools get caught. And the more that you're able to, as a threat actor, live off the land, use common tools, get credentials, RDP to a host, look for passwords on network shares, do common things that end users do, it's much more difficult for the defenders to be able to detect. And this is something that the threat actors understand as well. And this goes back to we only need to do as far as we need for tools to accomplish the objective. And that's the same thing. Yeah. Threat actors look at that.
I'm just going to comment.
While we keep talking.
Yeah,
please, I was going to say, Devin, what you have taught me over the years in our forensic investigations is just really, I'll say, how basic the tools are that the threat actor uses. How many times I've been in forensic findings calls with you and clients where it's been, these are tools that are commonly used within the organization. They went undetected by fill in the blank monitoring tool. I bet it comes up in a very high percentage of our investigations because, as Jeff was saying, it's the way that they're able to bypass any detection because they look like an end user. And I would say that is, I don't know if I could go as high as 90%, but it's a very high number of our matters where the fancy EDR tool didn't detect anomalous behavior because it looked like a real user was using it. And I think of those of you who may be on the call that I've worked with before, I always put it in terms of what's on the house, right? You may have the fanciest security system on your house, but if you leave your door unlocked, someone can come in and get things very easily, and they may get detected, but they may have, left with the crown jewels before, before you were able to really respond to that. So it comes back to some of those basics, and when we get into the kind of regulatory component on the HIPAA side, that is really what the regulators are focused on. Are you doing the basics? That's great. We got all the fancy stuff, but are we doing the basics, like locking our doors?
Let's jump to that next slide because I think that actually underpins what you're really highlighting here, Lynn, and I think there's some animation in the slide. So ultimately, what's interesting to me is that the threat types that are concerning to those that have actually given us feedback from a healthcare perspective are, and again, I think there's credential access, insider threat, data leakage, and ransomware are really the top 4 here, right? And so these top 4, if they're at the forefront of concern for those that have responded to our survey, this is exactly where I think they should be focused. But it's also the cause and effect, in my opinion. Like, ransomware is not the event. Ransomware is the last step in the intrusion life cycle, preceded by multiple events, culminating in ultimately an incident. And it's the end game. It's the financially motivated end game. Data leakage, same thing. It's the culmination of an intrusion life cycle that moves through multiple stages. And Jeff, you hit this on a second ago. These, while they're top concerns, it's not just the end thing that we should be so focused on. It's how did the threat actor get to there, or how can they get to that? there's a current trend we're seeing in our incident response investigations right now across the board and globally, where threat actors are frankly leveraging capabilities to unhook the fancy security tools, the EDR technologies, that endpoint detection response technology that many companies are embracing, as they should, but they're actually unhooking those and then still running their tools because now they're not even being monitored or captured. All of these, frankly, are exactly what leads to the threat type we have escalated here. Let's keep going. So we're going to start talking a little bit about the threats the healthcare industry faces. The last couple slides have kind of set the tone at a very high level, but from a statistical standpoint, I mentioned about 3,000 or so investigations annually, and look, Baker and Hostetler has their data that frankly is probably that or more because they see from so much more perspective across the global environment. Ultimately, these are where the rough percentages break down. Email compromises in this day and age still leads from an incident type of the most prolific thing we are all responding to. Even in the day, and frankly, the adoption of second factor or multi-factor authentication, it's still leading. And what I typically get asked is, well, are these just individuals that have not protected with MFA? The answer is no. In fact, in the last 30 days, I went and pulled some data before jumping on this bridge. In the last 30 days, 96% of the business email compromises that Kroll has intake and started working, MFA was on the account. Because of what Jeff said a few minutes ago, attackers learn how to overcome the safeguards put in place and pivot. We can have a whole presentation on how, but ultimately it's still a leading piece. Email's ubiquitous. Everyone's leveraging it. We're on it right now during this call, right? And so ultimately it is also a gateway to the collection of data, the understanding of an environment. An address book alone can give you extreme insight into an organization before you pivot and continue on your attack. Ransomware, still a leading trend. It's a financially motivated leading trend with sometimes the highest payout. Even with what I think is a good trend where more victims are not paying, where they're opting to leverage, rebuild, or restore from backups, it is still one of the leading motivators for organized crime groups. And insider threat was on the last slide. I want to talk about it very briefly and we're going to keep going. Insider threat is very interesting. It's not to be overshadowed by the big fancy news article breaking articles that are being shared every single week about ransomware. Insider threats are still something that Lynn, I know you and I respond to on a fairly regular basis, and it's frankly some of the times the most haunting types of cases. It's an individual with placement and access, trusted placement and access to an organization that frankly doesn't ever leverage malware. They take the data because they have the access to it, whether they're going to a competitor or they're looking to take their research or their intellectual property someplace else, or frankly use it for sometimes even criminal or illicit means. It's still a leading trend, top three, frankly, from a statistical point in time of what we see every year. Let's keep going. I want to keep us on track. Okay. How are they getting in, right? So the last slide was giving us the threats the industry faces, but this is a little bit more of the other end of that spectrum. How are they actually getting? Well, look, phishing link, I think, is the most common aspect we see. But external remote services, VPNs, Citrix jump boxes, think about the ways you all, as attendees listening to our voice on this call, how do you access your enterprise, your business, your corporation, your healthcare records, your records management systems remotely when you're traveling from your phone, from your iPad, from your laptop? This is what we mean by remote services. Every single one of those connection points, those gateways to access secure or sensitive data, is an entry vector. It is the number 2 leading cause of unauthorized access, whether from vulnerabilities, from potential lack of MFA coverage, to credential harvesting that just allows threat actors to push that MFA prompt to the device, overwhelm the user where they eventually say accept. It is still the leading cause for getting in. So I think from an industry perspective, clients, healthcare industries are putting the right tools in place, but it also comes with user education. The fourth one on this I want to speak about very briefly, we're going to keep going. Zero-day exploits. There is no plan for getting punched in the face. That's exactly what a zero-day exploit is, right? To use the analogy. You can have all the security, you can have all the patching in place, but an exploit is exactly that. It's an unknown vulnerability leading to an escalation or leading in totality to gaining unauthorized access and privilege. We're seeing that every single day within our industry. We're seeing it now globally, from perimeter appliances to firewalls to VPNs. If it's a way to get to the next step of an intrusion, it is absolutely going to be researched to figure out how it can be exploited. Let's keep going. So now, Jeff, we're going to let me go on mute, let everyone take a little bit of a breather from my voice and switch it over to you.
Sounds great. All right, let's flip to the next slide if you would. So let's summarize this as easy. I'm with all of you on the call. Hospitals are hard. Medical is hard. It is not an easy environment to secure. I have heard from more than one person, well, we tried to change things to a longer password than 8 characters, but the doctors all got upset and started saying, patients will die if I have to type more than 8 characters to log in. Not an easy environment to operate in, especially if you're there. So if you are, on this side of the call and you're doing the good fight day in and day out, thank you. Your work matters, and it's important that you continue doing it. What we see typically with healthcare environments are places that run 24 hours a day, which makes patch cycles very difficult. The example I'll generally mention to a lot of clients is, all right, we have, heart rate monitoring equipment on this one floor that monitors heart rates from every room to a nurse's station. Okay, so when do we patch that? If it's down for an hour, is that a problem? Do we need to have a nurse by every patient when that happens? Those aren't easy problems to be solved. Do we need to turn the floor off to do this type of patching? And so often many of the systems tend to languish a little bit, and I see many health environments kind of segmenting into 2 types of networks: the network that they can manage and the network they can't manage. And that's sometimes a reasonable way to mitigate some of the risk, but it's not a great long-term strategy for mitigating that risk. We also see differences in what the capacity is for a rural clinic versus a large hospital that has multiple facilities, or a hospital corporation that has facilities in multiple states. Not an easy problem for either of those groups to solve. The larger hospital has the problem of a sprawling infrastructure and way more employees. And that is one piece that's also a challenge for the healthcare industry. If you look at the number of employees versus the amount of revenue and facilities, it's a very high employee rate for a business to run that way. And so when you have that many employees, you have more email accounts, you have more laptops, you have more devices, that attack surface just grows and grows. Regulation is difficult. HIPAA, it's really important. It needs to be, it's there, it's kind of the Bible that you have to obey from a security standpoint, but it also isn't as prescriptive as I would like to see. It's not like PCI where it's you shall do this, this, this. And Lynn and I have had more than one discussion on the whole of what does the word appropriate mean? Appropriate to who? How is that? And really the only way it turns into appropriate is either you look at it, what you see in the industry, and you hope you got it right, or you get into a bad event and then the lawyers get involved and then they hash out what they think was appropriate depending upon the situation. We also see, some differences in on-premise services and off-premise services. That's pretty significant when some of them are run by the hospital and some of them are outsourced. That's another piece to consider in the mix there. And there's generally some big differences in how those two will often handle and the resources that each of them have and the timing. But all of this comes to the real point that you need to have appropriate testing to understand where the risk is. And we find that many organizations don't have the capacity to do that internally. And even if they do, it often turns into a situation where a self-audit doesn't have the same level of understanding within the organization on where the risks really are. And so the last bullet here is just really on legacy systems. And we see that all the time. That's not an easy problem to solve. And we do work with plenty of clients coming up with some compensating controls that are going to assist them after these are worked to make sure that they do have appropriate controls that for a system that isn't replaceable easily just because of the age of that system. And sometimes it turns into, yeah, we got to replace the whole MRI system to get rid of Windows 7. Those are some of those type of situations where Kroll can help as well. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay. Lynn, do you want to take a little bit here on the regulatory side?
Sure. So you teed me up nicely talking about HIPAA, and anyone who has worked with me knows I rarely defend HIPAA, but I'm going to make this statement kind of overall. So HIPAA is actually a pretty good regulatory scheme in spite of there being lack of specificity, as Jeff described. And the reason that is exactly what was seen on the last slide. HIPAA has to apply to a small physician's office, a rural clinic, and a large, academic medical center multi-location system. And so it's intentionally flexible, at least that's what the regulators tell us. I also think that it's flexible for the OCR such that they can catch people when they feel like they need to. But let's kind of talk a little bit about the security roles. So as I mentioned earlier, really it comes down to the basics. And I've handled probably coming up on about 700 OCR investigations over the last 14 years. And a variety of different privacy and security incidents that we've worked on with the Office for Civil Rights and the covered entity and business associates that are our clients. And what we're seeing in the security rule front is it comes back to what we've got listed up there. The number one thing is conducting an annual security risk analysis. It's not required that you go outside. It can be conducted by an internal team. I think it's always good to have some external resources, at least from time to time, come in and do the security risk analysis. So you can get the benefit of what's happening across the industry. Just a couple of years ago, I reached out to Devin to talk with him about the metapixel issue, right? And then 6 months later, we saw the Office for Civil Rights come down with guidance around that, and that it needed to be included in security risk analysis. Those are things that we had not yet seen our clients started to pivot on, but then we were seeing that, but the industry now has since started to answer on that, including things like the use of tracking technologies as part of the security risk analysis. So getting the benefit of that broader group by having an external party come and help you out, doesn't have to be every single year, but at least on a periodic basis, because I think it helps lend some credibility to the internal ones that you all may be doing. From that security risk analysis becomes your risk management plan. So risk management plan, we want to see things on there. The OCR expects to see things on there because no entity is in perfect security posture at the time of a security risk analysis conducted. And we have clients reach out saying, oh, we don't want to include that because, gosh, what if OCR sees that and says, why haven't you taken care of that? It's like, okay, well, if it's a high priority or if it's low hanging fruit, then you need to take care of it. If it's something that can be pushed out for multiple months or even longer, then that's okay too. Just put those milestones on your risk management plan. That's what they expect to see. Now, I say that having been involved with clients that unfortunately have been investigated by OCR, and we do see them say things like, okay, you're a big multi-location health system. You should have addressed that type of security prior to the 18 months that you put on your risk management plan. Or you didn't identify certain risks that you should have identified because they were industry known at the time of your risk analysis. So those are the types of things that we do see the OCR doing, kind of, in my view, being a little bit unfair to covered entities in these investigations. But this is absolutely basic. It's asked in every single one of our investigations. And it's something that the OCR does look at and send to their non-lawyer subject matter experts. They've got security people on staff that they will, or by contract that they will send these to determine whether or not they're adequate and appropriate. So this is what Jeff's going to push back on me a little bit, because we do want to have appropriate security safeguards and kind of looking back on what Devin had said earlier or kind of posed to me earlier. This is a moving target because the security landscape is constantly changing. What standard of care today may be completely different than what standard of care a year from now, 2 years from now. I mean, we've seen a tremendous explosion in the way that bad guys are getting into systems these days, even going back just 3 or 4 years ago. What we thought we knew about ransomware and the way attackers get in is completely different today than it was during COVID in 2020 and 2021. So this is absolutely a moving target. The standard of care changes, and I'm using that term intentionally because I'm talking with healthcare folks. The standard of care changes over time. multi-factor authentication, in spite of bad guys being able to get around it, is absolutely expected today. 6 years ago, when we were handling business email compromises for clients, many of them didn't have multi-factor in place, and the OCR was saying, essentially, if you put multi-factor in place, we will dismiss your investigation. And we saw almost nearly all of ours, I would say all of our business email compromises get dismissed by the OCR when the covered entity took those steps to put the safeguards in place. Today, we're kind of seeing a move towards EDRs. Like, do you have something in place that is monitoring your ingress and egress into your systems? We've not yet had them come back and say it's standard of care, but we see enough healthcare entities year on year that are deploying some type of EDR tool such that it is appearing to be standard of care, particularly for our larger healthcare organizations. So I'm going to kind of pause there because I think appropriate it's a little unfair to say that, but it's also the way that it does get teed up in the industry. Jeff, any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big challenge on it, because really governmental documentation and regulations, they don't grow every year. They don't get updated every year. The federal government doesn't have the resources or the staff to be able to maintain what the appropriate list would be. So you really need to have a wider industry perspective to understand where things are moving, what's coming up next. Like I think for the phishing piece, we're going to start to see more hardware tokens being used, more FIDO3 type applications to avoid some of the phishing and some of the MFA bypasses that are going on now. I think we're going to start to see more phishing, or excuse me, more vishing, as we're starting to see with calls into help desks to try to change credentials. And I think in the future, you're going to likely see controls that are set up where it's like, hey, what's your plan for authenticating people that call into your help desk? That's a reasonable cybersecurity piece, and we still see many organizations that don't really have a fulsome plan from that perspective. And we still do many social engineering engagements with organizations where one of our skilled staff members calls over and says, hey, I'm Bob. I'm working at my grandma's house today and I can't log in. Can you help me? And it's like, sure, we can change your password. Sure, I still can't log in. Maybe if you reset my MFA, it'll work better. You do have my new telephone number, right? Those type of lines seems to still, unfortunately, be very successful.
And I will tell you this, it's going to drive your physicians crazy. And we have definitely seen that as we've hardened up our the ability to get in through MFA or whatever the security that may be in place. Physicians will scream the loudest. So just be prepared for that. But it's absolutely important, as you're seeing, many of you are probably subject to the Change Healthcare incident that affected a very, very large system with lots of money behind it. And we've certainly gotten the attention of a lot of executives and boards at our healthcare clients. Kind of along those same lines, though, speaking of ransomware and ensure that you've got disaster recovery and business continuity plans in place. This is, again, kind of a basic that the OCR is looking at following ransomware attacks, that you have those plans in place, that you test those plans. Jeff mentioned earlier about doing tabletops. It's a good opportunity to test those plans in those scenarios and revise them, as you're finding things that may be new to your organization or you're hearing things that are happening in the industry. Ensure that you are addressing those in all the plans that you have in place. I'm going to speak a little bit on the Office for Civil Rights. It's probably the regulator that I deal with most frequently. Every single client gets investigated, covered entity, business associate gets investigated if they report an incident that involves 500 or more people. Sometimes if there happens to be some media focus on something that you maybe didn't report, you may still also draw an investigation. Of course, patients can complain about things that they perceive as being privacy or security issues, and you may get investigated around that as well. So my firm handles hundreds of investigations every single year. In this, we're working with the Office for Civil Rights at least on a weekly basis, if not more frequently. So we've got a good view into what seems to be appropriate to them and really where they're focusing their efforts, regardless of the administration that may be in Washington. And we do see a different focus depending on who is leading that particular office. So investigations are ongoing. There is a big focus on security at this point in time. As I mentioned, they've got security SMEs that do review a lot of security information that we provide as part of those investigations. And we've also seen some enforcement activity. Just this year alone, we've seen covered entities that have been fined, over $4 million, one that was close to $1 million. And so the OCR is still looking, and those were both security incidents. The OCR is still, looking at the enforcement piece as being a way to get information out to other covered entities. So when you see an enforcement action, or a resolution agreement, corrective action plan that comes down, ensure that you are looking and seeing what it is that the OCR at least thinks is important about those particular matters. And because there have been a security focus, I think it would be very helpful to the group here that you're seeing what the OCR is at least penalizing those organizations for. And then recognized security practices. Probably about 3 years ago, we saw a change in high tech where they added a mitigating factor for organizations that have what are called recognized security practices. If you don't know what those are, I'm happy to provide those to you separately. You can reach out to Kroll and I can get those over to you, the types of questions that get asked. But basically, it's looking again at some of the basics. Do you have policies and procedures in place? Are you doing appropriate risk assessments? Do you have appropriate incident response plans in place? And I'm using that term appropriate intentionally because, again, it's a little bit of a moving target. And what that's designed, what the recognized security practices are designed to do, and I usually will tell my clients, let's respond to those questions, even though we don't think we're going to get penalized. But we want to be able to demonstrate to Office for Civil Rights that we've got some good security practices in place from day one. So it's kind of like a good chance to make your first impression very, very good on the security front. But what it's designed to do is if you get into an enforcement or a resolution agreement situation with the OCR, it's designed to help mitigate whatever they believe the penalties are. And it's a little flexible on their part as far as what they see around this. But I always, again, look at it as an opportunity to tell the OCR, look, we were really good on the security front in spite of the incident that happened. And then we're seeing more and more state law requirements come out on the security front. Most of my clients are not-for-profit healthcare systems, so it doesn't apply to them, or there may be exemptions for HIPAA under those state laws. But just be aware, more and more states are putting together comprehensive privacy and security rules to help protect things like very sensitive health information. And so we're seeing more and more organizations not only be subject to HIPAA, but also have to look at the state laws to see, okay, does it apply to our employees? Does it apply to other areas of our business that may not be covered by HIPAA or may not be part of our nonprofit organization? So just be aware of those types of things. I think we're going to see more and more. I expect to see something come out of Washington following the Change Healthcare matter. So just, I would say, more work for me to do as a privacy lawyer, but also more for all of you to kind of keep on your toes about what's coming down from a regulatory perspective. And you can go to the next slide.
Lynn, I think you're spot on, and that's actually a perfect segue. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the things, we've got 3 slides here, and I want to keep us moving, but all the really good talk that you and just Jeff focused on actually leads up to what happens after the investigation, happens after the OCR investigation or during it, and that's the notification piece. So we've got kind of a set slide from our State of Healthcare report, and I also want to give a quick shout out. I know it was mentioned at the very beginning. This is one of the handouts attached today. If you have not already downloaded and acquired a copy of that, please do. But ultimately, the popularity of the healthcare industry and typically the volume of data that healthcare has is frankly part and parcel to exactly why they're the most breached industry. Look at the 2022 to 2023 rankings here. Healthcare has remained in the top 2. It was top 1 last year, and it's a very close margin, frankly, to finance even this year. Let's go to the next slide, because this is the part that starts to bring the notification piece full circle. So you have your incident, you have the investigation, you identify the population of individuals at risk whose data was viewed, accessed, or acquired in an unauthorized manner. Lynn, her team, a legal team does the legal analysis against all the state, against the federal systems, perhaps even the international systems, to understand how to notify, under what legal framework to notify. And that leads then to what we call notifications. Within Kroll, we have a part of our business that does breach notification services. Call centers, the letters, if you've ever gotten a credit monitoring, those are things that you probably have gotten a letter at some point. Many of you have probably from Kroll. And it's because we're sending a letter at the direction of counsel, Lynn, maybe her team, saying this individual needs to be notified, because of legal frameworks we have, that their data has been compromised, and we're going to do what we can do best to help provide identity monitoring services, credit monitoring, and ultimately help protect them so the data that was unfortunately put at risk is not used to further harm them. Ultimately them, the John and Jane Doe who are affected by this, right? But the year-over-year increases in the number of inquiries that even Kroll gets following an incident is up. Almost 99% increase year over year, even into 2023 when finance and healthcare switched as the most breached, almost 100% increase on the actual identity monitoring being issued. Still targeted, still top of mind, and heavily regulated. Let's go to the next slide. We touched a little bit on this already. I think I don't want to spend too much time here. I want to be balanced with time, but ultimately, I want to draw one specific point to bullet number 2. Ransomware threat groups, organized crime groups, right? Financially motivated, kind of modern day mafia groups, if you will. They're 24/7 operations. They're focused on monetizing evil. And ultimately, they don't need to sleep. They don't need to slow down. They have global operations just as much as your security operations center do, and just as much as your healthcare organizations may, with especially the healthcare parts that have kind of 24/7 shops. Lynn, any additional comments on this slide before we move on?
Yeah, so I think that there's not only is it a data-rich environment, but it's an incredibly open environment too, right? So it's not just that the cybersecurity is less mature, it's also in the sense that you've just got to have access to everything at any given point in time, right? So as it's reflected here on the slide, we want to, when you think about your physicians asking for access, when you think about all the caregivers asking for access, it creates this very open environment where they have to hop from patient to patient to patient to patient in various different systems that they may have in place. So, so those are the types of things that we hear frequently from our clients, and we hear from those on the security side as being kind of a large concern relative to that. And then 2, you can't get rid of the data, right? Like you just can't get rid of it. We work with a lot of systems that are leading research on curing cancer, or leading research on filling in the blank of the, whatever it is that particular organization may do. And the researchers and physicians and others are like, we've got to maintain this information about patients year on year. We also, from a medical malpractice perspective, and also from a regulatory compliance perspective, from payment, we have to keep a lot of data on patients and payments that are made, so that we can meet any of our regulatory requirements around that. So it's not just about HIPAA as far as maintaining data. It's also about all of these other types of things that need to be in place so that you can so your organization can be compliant in having to answer to a lot of different regulatory agencies.
Jeff, I think you've got the next 4 or so slides as we start to head towards wrap up.
Sure. All right. So, I think if we take a peek at outsourcing, many orgs, they want to outsource services. Some of them have realized, well, we can't do this. We don't have the specialty to do this. One of the mistakes I often see for many organizations is wanting to build their own security operations center. At this point in time, I don't think I have seen an organization with less than 5,000 employees actually be able to do a decent security operations center on their own. Lots of challenges there for how do you staff it? How do you keep it 24 hours a day? How do you manage it? And what we have seen more often here in healthcare that is less likely to do some of the outsourcing is occasionally they're in a situation where they look at outsourcing somewhat piecemeal. They don't have great alignment across that. And we've seen more than one organization where their outsourced security operations group was completely different in the way that the internal team responded. So, trying to find that alignment and the appropriate blend is important. There's far too many agreements that we have seen for outsourcing of services, especially in security operations, where the contract contains a provision like, we'll notify you within 10 minutes of any confirmed event. And the that confirmed event often gets used as a very much a weasel word, where the organization will be like, well, yeah, we notified you within 10 minutes, but the event occurred 3 days ago. We just confirmed it today. And we see that often on our penetration tests, where the third party may discover us and they'll be, we saw you 2 days ago on one of our domain controllers. It's like, yeah, that's way too long. For most of the alerts, a more appropriate timetables can be measured in hours or minutes, but expending it out in anything past 3 to 4 hours is probably a pretty useless alert at that particular point, because it's likely that the threat actors already had an opportunity to accomplish goals. All right, next slide. So that's a positive stat from that perspective. I just will caution everybody, picking the right provider that's going to help you with your security services is pretty important. I'm a little biased considering I work here, but we have the ability to help all of our clients pretty much on any cyber related item that you can come up with. We have a global team, well over, Stefan, are we over 600 now as far as people? So, the staff is, so, over 600 staff. We have over 140 that are just in offensive security as far as the team goes. We are prepared, we're willing, we really would love to help you and engage. So please, consider us when you're looking at some of the outsourcing that you might be doing in the next year. Okay, next. Devin, you want to take the summary? You want me to start to run through some of that?
No, I want to be sensitive to time. So again, the handout we have goes into this much more in depth. So please feel free to grab a copy of it. There's almost 100 of you on the bridge today. It's extremely awesome showing. This is really the summary pieces we want to leave you all with as we start to wrap up with the 1 or 2 more slides we have. That 4th bullet, I think, is the most interesting one, right? There's a lot of unknown, no matter what industry you're in. And our threat intel team takes the data, takes the tactics, the knowledge gleaned from every single one of the 3,000 or so investigations we do every year, and wraps that into these reports that we put out. Because we want to give back. We want to share back what we're finding. Because at the end of the day, if threat actors were completely muted by every organization being at the best they could possibly be, and we frankly could turn the tide back against organized crime groups, against nation state actors where they are defeated, and I don't know if that'll happen in my lifetime, but it's a goal of mine, then we've done a good job, and I can finally have a good night's sleep. But that's ultimately the piece that I think you can take away from the report, is we're giving back the information we hope you can use to help shore up the defenses within your organization and take some lessons learned from what we've seen from the trenches. Let's go to the next slide. So again, I think one piece, and Lynn, I'd love your 2 cents on this. At some point in time, you're going to likely have need to bring in outside consultants to give even a different perspective, to augment your team, to help get through that right of boom, the bad day. The 4th bullet here is equally what I would put focus on. Have the contracts, the legal agreements vetted by your internal and outside counsel, have them in place. Not always necessarily a retainer, although those are fantastic too, but have all of the red lines to the terms and conditions for the vendors you want to work with out of the way. Because when unfortunately the bad event does happen, you don't want to necessarily sign something you don't necessarily agree with from a legal risk perspective. You equally don't have necessarily the luxury to sign and go back and forth through legal and procurement processes. Let's have a relationship. Let's have a discussion ahead of time, whether it's us or another vendor. The whole goal here is get the contracts out of the way, so when you need to go, it's go time. And that SLA that you've executed and negotiated can absolutely be hit. Lynn, perspective on that?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific point, Devin. And I mean, I know you all meet with a lot of prospective clients. We do as well. It's our agreements we will start running without things being signed, but typically our no forensic firm that we work with is able to do anything more than scoping without an agreement being signed. And so to the extent that you all can, whether we reach out to Kroll and work through your legal departments on the contract negotiations, get a business associate agreement in place as well. There is not a lot of flexibility or time if the worst happens, which in healthcare is a ransomware attack. Even though it may not be the #1 thing that's happening in healthcare based on Kroll's data, it is probably the most devastating to our healthcare clients because y'all are a 24/7 operation. You have to keep the doors open. You have to continue to care for patients. You can't just transfer all your patients out of the hospital. And many times you can't stop seeing patients in the emergency department. So it's critically important to have these partnerships in place. And if you've got it documented in writing, it just makes things go much more smoothly should the worst event happen.
And the piece that I'll also throw in there is, if you're able to reach out to us for some proactive services before you potentially need to see Devin, the situation goes far simpler because we already understand what the organization is, how you're built, who the players are, who the people are. We already have the contracts in place, and it's a much smoother transition in that type of an unfortunate event. So, I would really encourage it from that perspective. My job is really to prevent Devin from having any work. If I can pull it off, I am failing miserably at it right now because there are still plenty of orgs out there that need help. But if we can help you, we'd like to do that.
Okay, let's move to the next slide as we start to wrap this up for everyone. And I think almost 50 minutes into this, you all have been an amazing audience. I know there's probably some questions. If you want to start putting those in the chat, we'll start queuing those up for some answers here. But what's next while all of you are entering and hopefully asking some questions of us to address? What's next? From the three of our perspectives, what do we see? And we put some thoughts together here. I'm going to start on this, but ultimately, look, AI is a huge buzzword right now. It's a buzzword because it's being integrated from every piece of software I seem to have installed, from certain software products that I use every day to others where, frankly, even the apps on my phone is coming up and now having AI integrated. I'm not sure I'm quite comfortable with all of that, but the point is, it's here. There is no separating it from the software products and licensing, which means we have to embrace it, which means we have to understand from a security perspective, what is that tool? AI is just a tool, right? What is a tool doing with your data? And in healthcare, and I imagine Lynn would probably echo this or shout this from the rooftops as well, what is that automated intelligence, that artificial intelligence doing with the data that you're potentially feeding it so that it can help you automate, right? Is it leaving your enterprise, going to a third party? Are the proper legal agreements in place to protect HIPAA data, protected health information, right? And the use of your employees, the training and the education of your employees around the use of these systems. It's one thing to load a spreadsheet of data in and let an AI or machine learning system maybe reorganize, proof it, potentially identify information for it. It's a whole nother when you realize where that data might be flowing to outside of your control because you're using a third party to help automate. BECs, Jeff touched on this earlier. Look, a BEC, a business email compromise, is not always just, I got a link and I clicked it, I need to be educated through some annual training. Sometimes it's exactly what he pointed out with the threat actors are evolving. Now it's sometimes you're actually going to the legitimate website, but you pass through a website that's malicious that intercepts the credentials. We call attacker in the middle methodologies. Sometimes it's someone socially engineering the call center, which we've seen with more sophisticated threat groups like Scattered Spider and others that are in the news right now, right? That's not actually even your user clicking the wrong thing. It's ultimately someone impersonating them and taking advantage from a social engineering perspective. Vishing, Jeff mentioned this earlier, the fact that we're moving away from those other buzzwords, phishing, trying to base them with an email. Now we're into phishing. Now we're into smishing. I'm going to stop there because the terms actually start to give me a headache. But at the end of the day, it's threat actors leveraging the technologies we use and adopt and frankly endorse, and using them against us. Right? Lynn, anything on the last bullet before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it already. I think the future of the legal and regulatory piece of it is we are seeing nearly 100% when our healthcare clients have to do a breach notification of any size. I used to say if it was a 7-figure breach, so $1 million or more, then it went down to if you have a 6-figure breach, 100,000 or more. Now I'm saying if you have a 5-figure breach, so 10,000 or more people, you are likely going to be, and I will say, a victim of a class action lawsuit. So the plaintiff's attorneys are watching what gets posted on the OCR website. They are watching what gets posted on some of the AG's websites, and they are filing lawsuits just at the drop of a hat. So the minute that something gets announced, whether it's in the media or if it's on a regulatory site, we see lawsuits get filed almost instantaneously. And similarly with the regulators, the OCR is fairly predictable. We've got a long history of working with them, but the state AGs have really started coming into the fray. And depending on the state in which you do business, you may find yourself subject to a regulatory investigation from an attorney general, and they've got teeth. They can penalize you as well, and they can penalize you under the HIPAA scheme. So there's a lot of kind of, I'll say, if I'm looking at my crystal ball, that's what I see coming ahead in the next couple of years.
Sadly, we've run out of time today. There was so much amazing content that the team went through, so I really hope you found it all useful. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email us, and we'll make sure to get back to you with any of your questions and answers for you. A huge thank you again to everyone that has taken the time to tune in. We hope you found it informative. As a quick reminder, the State of Cyber Defense Healthcare Report is available for download. It's also in the session, so please do take a read it and let us know if you have any questions on it. And when you're leaving the briefing, you'll be directed to a short survey. If you could please just spare a few moments, we'd really appreciate it if you could just tell us your thoughts on the session, as it helps us prepare for future webinars. Once again, thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.